friends, Romans, communicators. Hello, welcome back. Chapter 4 is all about language and what the difference is between language and communication. And this chapter can be a little bit technical, so I'm going to walk us through it and see if I can make some of these elements of language make a little bit more sense. And we'll illustrate them with a few case studies that, for me at least, help clear up which creatures on the planet are communicating and which are using language and why it matters. Language is a part of communication, just like hearing or perceiving is part of communication, but it's only part of communication. An important piece, but still not the whole thing. Language and communication are not the same thing, and why that matters we'll get to in a little while. Language, and this is the technical definition, which we'll deconstruct further, is a structured system of symbols used for communicating meaning. Okay, so we're going to break this down a little bit. A structured system of symbols used for communicating meaning. Those symbols inside of language are words, followed by letters. Letters and words together compose the symbols that we are manipulating to make language instead of communication. On a really basic level, that means speaking or signing instead of just pointing. To get really technical, words are a unit of language consisting of one or more spoken sounds or the written representation that function as a principal carrier of meaning. So letters and words carry a meaning. And in addition to carrying not just any meaning, that meaning is arbitrary. So language is a structured system of symbols used for communicating meaning. Those symbols are words, and those words are arbitrary. And what that means is that really often, words do not look or sound like their meaning. And there are exceptions to this. Some words are not arbitrary. Think about comic book words. Comic book words that bam, pow, anything that can be an onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia means a word that is not arbitrary. And these are exceptions to our rules. And the rule in general holds that most words do not sound like how they, what they mean. They do not mean the way they sound. That's what arbitrary is. And there are languages, complete languages, that have a little bit of exception to this. American Sign Language, for example, just like the onomatopoeia, meow, when we say meow, we are doing the sound. M-E-O-W directly relates, is not arbitrary, to what the word means. Meow is actually what the cat says. And in American Sign Language, for example, cat. Cat. It's not arbitrary. Those are the whiskers. Or in sign language, to emphasize something, you can just make it bigger. The word very becomes very. So it's not completely arbitrary, but these are the exceptions. Most of those symbols inside of language that are letters and words are typically, most of the time, arbitrary. Language also has rules. In order to differentiate communication from language, language is what follows really strict rules. These rules are pronunciation and spelling, right? So we have decided that in our state, we pronounce bag a certain way, or cheese, or yeah, sure. These are rules about how we say certain words and letters. And it can vary from place to place, but there are still rules. Also called semantics, that we have agreed on a definition, that there is a difference between the meaning of grass and tree, that plants might mean both, but we have a rule about the word grass and what it means, and a rule about the word tree and what it means. Those are called semantics. We also have rules about grammar, how we conjugate things to indicate future tense, past tense, current tense. I am speaking on a video, I did speak on a video, I will speak on a video. That conjugation of did, will, and am are conjugation grammar rules. We also have syntax, another really important rule, that within each language dictates the order of the noun and the verb and the adjectives and the adverbs, right? So that I say, I will be talking on a video, not video, I will be talking. That order is our syntax. And some languages have more flexibility with certain parts of that than others. So in addition to spelling and pronunciation and grammar and syntax and semantics, those are some of our rules. We also have some rules that are governed by culture and context. So language, a piece of communication, has to have arbitrary symbols, the words and the letters, and they have to have rules, our grammar and our syntax, and we also have to have context and culture. So culture becomes a big piece of language that outside of how you put together a sentence to make sense inside of the formal rules, there are many cultural rules that bind and dictate how and when we say certain things. We don't typically meet a stranger for the first time and say, I love you. We typically say, nice to meet you. That our culture has dictated about our language that a phrase is appropriate in one setting, but not in another. And they also give meaning, right? So if we are sitting in a vineyard and I say, I'd like some more wine, we pictured W-I-N-E, not a child fussing for something. Our context gave us that clue, so that words that sound the same, homophones, we can distinguish between them because we are culturally capable of picking up the context. So that, again, the requirements for language that are just a part of communication must have context and culture. They must have formal rules that we mostly follow, and they must be arbitrary, right? That most of our words are not meow. Most of our words are designated by rules of culture and context and grammar and spelling, which has been standardized since a few hundred years ago. And that if we don't follow these things, we might be communicating, but not with language per se. So we're going to explore the borderlands of language versus communication, including just some of the pieces. What happens if we have two of these rules working and one of them is not? Is it language? Is it communication? Why does it matter if this breaks down? And one of the easiest ways to explore this is it unique to humans? Instead of exploring whether or not we're correctly using language with other humans, just right off the bat, it becomes useful to see that humans have a unique capacity for language that other animals may not. It helps us illustrate the requirements for language that might otherwise seem nitpicky and obvious, and why does it matter? So we are going to dive into a little TED video, and they use slightly different definitions than we do, but they illustrate them really, really well. So I think it's worth using so that we can do some translating together, and the elements of language that they name a little bit differently, I will translate right after the video, and their illustrations are really great. Feel free to watch this video multiple times until the definitions of what is and is not language start to sink in a little bit, and we'll in fact refer back to this one. So I'm going to pause for just a minute while you watch the TED video that helps define and illustrate the concepts about what defines language, especially relative to humans versus animals. They use different animals to illustrate when certain components of language are or are not present. So I will count to 3 and then we'll move on with the translation. 1, 2, 3. So in their video, you may have noticed that instead of saying symbols that are arbitrary, they referred to it as discrete, right? Discrete for them meant arbitrary. Arbitrary and discrete in their video are the same thing. That again means that most of our words are not meow, right? That clacking crab's claw literally just means, look, I can clack. I am healthy enough to clack. Not discrete, right? It is illustrating exactly what it is trying to talk about. So discrete, again, refers to the symbology and being arbitrary. The grammar that they talk about, every time in that video they talk about grammar or syntax, those are the formal rules that we were talking about, that dolphins may be able to talk about things that are not present and really complicated, but they have no grammar, no syntax, no spelling. They have no formal rules whatsoever. They can put I will drive the truck into any order. Truck, I will drive. You know, they don't have any of those formal rules. And when the video is talking about productive, that's more of the arbitrary. Productive means that the letters and the words are so arbitrary, just like magnetic poetry on a refrigerator, that they can be combined in infinite ways, right? You can make a new word following the formal rules with the letters of the alphabet. You can use those handful of letters to make infinite combinations. You can infinitely invent new words using those sounds and phonetic rules. So productivity, again, is just arbitrary and infinite. And they included displacement. Displacement is an important concept. It's not one that our book really includes because sometimes it has more to do with memory and cognition than it does with language. But linguists, who are very important to this world and study language forever, do like to differentiate between the cognitive ability to use language to effectively say if something was present tense, past tense, or future tense. And we'll come back to that a little bit too, but it's one that's not in the book. And then they also left out culture and context. And I think that part of what they're doing there is using displacement instead of culture and context, which is not a great plan. Culture is very, very important for language. It's not just in our textbook. Lots of linguists rely on that in order to have those formal rules, you have to have culture. That even if culture is how we interpret those formal rules, one can't exist without the other. So that video is really worth watching a couple times. If it doesn't make sense yet when I say that a symbol is arbitrary, you should go watch that again and see what they mean about discreteness. Or again, I think the dolphins are one of the best illustrations in there, that even if they have some displacement and they have culture and they have names for each other, they still don't have the formal rules. So definitely watch that video a time or two until it really starts to sink in. The differences, those components of language that make it different from culture are really becoming distinct in your mind. So because linguistics, the study of language, is such a giant field and people spend their entire lives and dissertations covering this topic, we're going to take a couple of case examples and see if we can use the elements of language or lack thereof to decide if certain creatures were communicating or if they were actually using language. The first one that we are going to watch is about Clever Hans. And there are actually 2 videos for this one. You can watch either or both or neither. There's also a Wikipedia link, and I will talk about it after the video. because I wasn't completely contented with any of the illustrations of Clever Hans that I was able to find. So go take a look at those, and we'll be right back. 1, 2, 3. So Clever Hans was a horse who, in front of a large crowd, just like the animated video, someone would say, "Clever Hans," and the handler would just be standing nearby. "Clever Hans, what is 5 minus 3? And he would stomp his feet 2 times. And there was nothing super obvious happening whatsoever, but it turned out when he was put in a controlled experiment and his handler wasn't visible, was only audible, Clever Hans couldn't do it. And his handler didn't know. Part of what's so awful about this story is that Clever Hans' handler thought that Clever Hans really could do this math. He didn't realize that his nonverbal, non-language communications were telling him when to start and when to stop stomping his foot. The handler fully thought that Hans could handle the language and the cognitive aspect of the math. But as it turned out, he was accidentally, just like with a tension in his body, telling Clever Hans when to start, when to stop. And he was very bummed to find out that he was participating in his own hoax. So part of what happened there in terms of language is that it wasn't symbolic, right? He didn't understand the numbers that were spoken, or, you know, if he'd been more visual, shown to him. He didn't understand the symbology of this number equals this number of objects, the symbol of plus or minus this number of objects. He couldn't do any of the symbology. He was only directly taking cues. There was no symbology, right? So the words or gestures that his trainer was using were discrete, right? Like tensing and then stopping were discrete phrases. If you could consider them signing words, they were discrete, they were arbitrary, but they weren't symbols. There was no symbology. There was only stop and start. Stop and start were the only two in play. They weren't productive. They weren't infinite. They weren't symbols. So next, I want you to go take a look at a little study that happened with chimpanzees that brings into play this component of symbology. And I'll pause here for you to go check it out. 1, 2, 3. So these chimps added symbology, right? These chimps were able to look at a model of a room that corresponded with a real room, and they could understand the difference. They could look at the symbol and understand that it meant the big room. They could watch their handler take a pretend treat and hide it in the symbol, and then they could go to the real version and find the real treat hidden in the same spot in the corresponding room. So they had symbology. So this demonstrated that, oh gosh, at least primates can do symbology. They understand that this is a symbol. This is not the real thing. This is not the real treat. They knew and understood that it was only a symbol, and they had to go to the real thing if they wanted the real treat. They could handle displacement no problem. This is not in the present moment. I'm about to go in there and find the real one, and they could translate the information from present moment to future moment with a symbol. Amazing, right? But it's not discrete or arbitrary in any way, right? The small room, the symbol, looked exactly like the big one. It's like meow. This room was directly related to what the big room looked like. It wasn't arbitrary in any way. It was completely an onomatopoeia in the chimpanzee's mind. They couldn't take a 2D map of the room and make an X where the treat was. It had to be a scale model of the bigger room. There was nothing arbitrary about it. It exactly represented. So symbology, yes. Discreteness, arbitrariness, no. So next, we are going to watch a video of a different primate who, instead of using a direct and corresponding exact scale model as a symbol has used some different symbols, has used modified American Sign Language as her symbols. So go take a look at Coco, and we'll come back and talk about what we thought of that. 1, 2, 3. So what did you think about Coco? Was she using symbols? And was there displacement? Could she talk about things that weren't currently happening, that weren't right in front of her? And was she using arbitrary symbols? Right? American Sign Language is a fully vested language. Plenty of the things she said, like world, right? That's arbitrary. It's not like holding up a picture of a globe or illustrating a globe. World, arbitrary, and it's a symbol, and she can talk about things that aren't right in front of her. What's not happening with Coco? What's not happening? She can't do any context or culture, and she doesn't have any formal rules. She can sign words in any order she wants. Her sentences are not sentences. They become just like a paragraph of words with no punctuation, and there's no context. She can't do the culture of the conversation. The reason it was edited so crazy is because they sit down with Coco and say things like, "Hey, how are you doing today?" And she'll be like, "Green." And then they realize that she's talking completely out of context with no cultural conversation skills about the lettuce that she sees off in the corner. She's saying green. She's like, "I would like that green, please." So she's using a symbol. She's using something that could be in another room, but she can't do a culturally appropriate conversation. She can't do any formal rules. She is just as likely as the dolphins to say, "Green, want, please, world, man, poop." Like, I mean, she just like straight up just like lists some words, symbols and displacement, but no cultural context and no formal rules. Which is hard for us to wrap our minds around because she's using an established language. She's just not following the rules. So next we have a parrot who demonstrates different skills. Pause for a moment and go watch Alex the parrot. 1, 2, 3. So Alex the parrot is fairly incredible. He's a great case because he can do that syntax. He knows how to do that grammar. He can say not only, "I want the green rectangle, not the purple rectangle." He knows where to put the red and where to put the purple, and that it matters which order the descriptors and the nouns are, right? So he performs syntax and grammar really well. He's got the rules nailed. The symbology, completely nailing it. The arbitrary, totally nailing it. Can pick up on spoken English words that, you know, are completely arbitrary. Green does not sound like the concept green, and he can perform it. What was missing for Alex was that he would often get the culture wrong, or it was unclear if he really understood it. When his handler would leave for the night, being a parrot and being very attached to his pair, which was his handler, he would say, as he was getting into his cage and she was leaving and shutting off the lights, "I'm sorry, come back, I love you, I'm sorry, come back, I love you, I love you, I'm sorry," right? And so it was unclear if he culturally understood the symbology of what he was saying. Did he mean, "I love you, I'm sorry," because he was perceiving love and perceiving that he must have done something wrong to get locked in? Or is this clever Hans all over again, where what happens sometimes when he says those phrases is that somebody comes back? So it is unclear if with the culture of Alex, he understood exactly what he was saying, or if he was just performing in ways that he thought would get him a treat, aka his handler to walk back and say hello again before going to bed. This debate will always rage because Alex died at an unexpectedly young age from a very rare parrot condition, so we'll never really know. We'll never get to do the complete controlled experiments for Alex. So instead, some research that is still continuing at the Iowa Primate Center is that Kanzi, the bonobo, and his family use several different kinds of human interactions to try and participate in language. So let's go watch a couple of videos about Kanzi, the bonobo, who is very similar to a chimpanzee, but a slightly different species, and his family. It would be most useful if you watched his novel Sentences video, and then if you also watched Lisa Ling and Oprah talking about Kanzi and Pan-Venetia. They are very cool. And in fact, if you want to look up more about Kanzi's recently deceased sister Pan-Venetia, it was kind of unbelievable. She could make herself ramen, completely with instructions just of verbal language from their handler. So in any case, go watch Kanzi try on some novel sentences, and go watch Lisa Ling and Oprah talk about their experiences at the Iowa Primate Center. 1, 2, 3. So part of what's exciting about the bonobos at the Iowa Institute is that they use several kinds of language. They use lexigrams, which are those touch screens or little symbols that the humans have created for them. They use audible human language. They use audible bonobo communication, which doesn't have any words that we can pick up on, and they use modified American Sign Language. So they have multiple ways of using most of the elements of simple language and symbology. They understand that a lexigram, one of those symbols that they have, is a symbol. They know it for what it is. They know that this particular parallelogram means noodles. They can make sentences in a correct order. They can say, I want noodles spicy, or I want noodles now. They can reference things that are nowhere near the room that they are in. But again, it becomes this question of, are they culturally, contextually interacting? They rarely ask questions themselves. Even if they can come up with a novel answer, just like Alex could out loud, or the bonobos can in response to questions, they so rarely make a novel combination of words in the correct order that hasn't already been put before them. So they are, again, getting parts of this. They understand the symbology. They can do some of the grammar, but it is unclear if they are meeting the requirements for cultural and context to come together. They might be the most debatable, but they still leave a little bit of wiggle room for debate, including if their linguistic, if their voice, if their physiology, or their cognition, if their neurobiology allows them to fully grasp human language. And something else that comes into play in the textbook, and after watching bonobos, is that part of what humans are drawing from the culture and context that's debatable about any other creature, including the dolphins and the bonobos, is that we have layers of meaning, several of them. We can perform denotative versus connotative. Denotative is what the dictionary defines a word. Connotative is that we have a personal meaning, right? And that we acknowledge this personal meaning. We understand the difference between what the dictionary says about spaghetti versus how our mom makes spaghetti. And bonobos can't do that. They definitely cannot look at a plate of spaghetti and picture the difference between mom spaghetti and dictionary spaghetti. They might be able to differentiate between their handlers' styles of spaghetti. That if one of them says, would you like spaghetti? Bonobo might say no to, this handler and ask for the other handler's spaghetti. But it's not clear if they can do those ladles of denotative versus connotative, which is the personal versus the dictionary. We can also do referent, which is again dictionary, versus reference, which is just more specific, right? We understand that referent from the dictionary would be vehicle. It would be vehicle, and we understand that reference for an object would be more specific. Jeep, car, truck, helicopter, boat. And it is unclear if any other creatures can do this complex cognition with the symbols and with the lineage of the symbols, which symbol comes above the others, the sorting of the language that we can use. We also have loaded language that has a real meaning in the dictionary that means something else in our culture, in our context, that the animals often wouldn't pick up on. Alex may have known the difference between literal black and white on a board of shapes, but he would have no idea what we were talking about if we tried to bring in race relations or any of these higher concepts. It's not just that his language couldn't do it, his cognition couldn't do it. He could say white and black, but he couldn't get the complex symbology, the loaded language, the referent versus reference, the denotative versus the connotative. He couldn't perform both levels and understand and hold both levels of language. We also use ambiguous language. You know, we talk about gray figuratively as the gray zone, gray area, someplace where the answer is a little bit muddled. But we also literally talk about the color gray to mean undecided. Is it black? Is it white? We don't know. So because we can use this ambiguous language that purposely could lead someone to not know which vehicle in the parking lot we were talking about, which Honda, the gray one, and then somebody goes out and like tries to decide, oh, you said gray, I don't know which one you meant because there's silver and there's black and there's white. That one's more blackish. It's a really light black, but is that really gray? So because we can purposefully and accidentally be ambiguous or use loaded language or understand the difference between a dictionary account and a personal account, we are slightly different than other creatures who even attempt to use modified languages that we've invented and try to use on their personal topics of interest, like bananas. They still can't quite pull off the same level of language that we're pulling off. Which also leads us to a definition out of your textbook, which is Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Sapir-Whorf. And that hypothesis is that language shapes our thinking and then our perception. That because we have a word for sparkly, our brain would interact with the word sparkly to look for something known to be sparkly, and then, oh, I can perceive the difference between matte and bland and sparkly. That until we have a word for an object or a concept, the concept doesn't fully exist for us. That not just do we look at something and think of the word, but that we almost can't perceive it until we have a word for the concept. That if we want to be able to understand a difference between A and B, we have to have words, we have to have language that illustrates the difference between A and B. Some of this can come out of the cliched stereotype story about, or anecdote about northern natives of Canada, who we often mistakenly call Eskimos, having so many words for snow. That because snow is so important, it's such an important concept, it not only has lots of different varieties of language and words and symbols that describe it, but when we say a very specific version of snow, it changes the perception of what is being perceived. It is not just a white field with trees covered in white, it's which kind. Is it damp and heavy? Is it light and fluffy and blowing all around? That combining this concept that is variable with language that is also variable changes how we think about it, that we define our reality by describing it. Okay? It also affects our credibility, how we talk about it. How we were talking about snow would affect our credibility. If someone from Florida who'd never been north tried to talk about snow, their credibility as a language user wouldn't be as strong. Why? It would often be because they would either speak in cliches, they've never seen 100 types of snow, so they don't know how to differentiate, or dialects. If someone from Texas was speaking in a southern accent about snow, the dialect alone would lead us to believe that, like, oh, no, you definitely can't know what you're talking about. You're from a desert state. Your dialect makes you sound like you're from a desert state and don't know what to talk about. Or weasel words. If someone dressed like a northern Wisconsin resident wearing a parka said things like, well, half of all weathermen predicted that this snow was going to be exactly this type, or all of everybody knows XYZ, anything that indicates a percentage of people or all of people, or famously, when Nixon said something like, I am not a crook, everyone immediately heard the word crook. Because it's a weasel word. A weasel word means that it sends up flags of like, why are you describing it that way? You are using language to purposely throw us off the trail of something. You tried to use language to push a meaning on it that we wouldn't have otherwise seen. And language, of course, has pros and cons, just like everything else. Just like culture can be amazing in a celebration, or it could be a difference so big that we have a hard time gulfing it. Language is the same way. Language can bring people together for affection or agreement, or to decide that we agree, or to share culture. Basically anything that brings us together, we as humans like to talk about. But the downside is, again, is that if there's a credibility problem, which just stems from a cultural difference, and someone's genuinely trying to talk about snow without having ever experienced it, you know, our brains recognize the language difference and sometimes don't always listen as well as we could. It can be used, you know, just like culture, for humor that works really well, and sugarcoating, and being sympathetic and empathetic, and making someone feel better. Or it can go a little too far if maybe we were responding to someone asking how they looked in a dress by saying that they look nice. We would linguistically pick up on that credibility difference. Or if we tried to laugh something off and our humor and language that was supposed to reflect humor went sideways. Or just we were speaking literally a different language, these things can interfere with communication. So language and its formal rules and all of its implications and arbitrariness can either be used as symbols that, just like culture, we use to come together, or that we use to create distance and maintain distance. There are also more disorders that affect language than affect communication. Obviously, there's some physiologies that, instead of doing literal hearing, use their eyes for language, or fingertips in the case of Braille. These are still language, even though the physiology is not set up for our most common forms of language usage. There are also lots of neurobiologies that struggle, or physiologies that struggle to use our really average language, that end up having to do variants on language. You can think of some if you've ever had a grandparent or relative or acquaintance, or even just seen a video of someone who's had a stroke, right? Or an aneurysm, or traumatic brain injury. Anything that causes aphasia, apraxia, dyslexia, Tourette's, autism, stroke, aneurysm, age, dementia, memory disorders, speech sound disorders, even something so simple as a cleft palate. All of these things can interfere with a person's ability to use language in the most common ways. And then we have to make accommodations to make sure that we're getting these arbitrary symbols translated correctly. So the moral of this chapter is, why do we bother knowing that language is different from communication? Why do we bother with all of this symbology and these rules? Like, grammar can be the worst. Oh, when a grammar stickler tries to correct something that was way less important than the meaning of your sentence, why do we bother with the semantics and rules at all? And the answer tends to be so that we're not Coco, right? We all want to know that our boss, that our coworker, that our friends, that anybody that we have any interaction with is capable of the higher thinking that's indicated by the correct language. And it's why we bother to translate for anyone who has trouble with language, is because we want to make sure that we are not collectively, culturally in the same place as Coco. We want to make sure that we're functioning better and not just listing words at random and not understanding cultural context. Coco is amazing for a gorilla, but we would have some human concerns about putting ourselves in the hands, for any reason, of someone who couldn't follow cultural and contextual codes, who couldn't perform the thinking that went along with making a sentence work right, which tends to correlate with human safety. So that is why we bother with learning spelling and grammar and language and translating anyone who has difficulty with language or from one language to another, is because we all want to make sure that we are as connected as possible. And it's much harder to feel connected with Coco than it is with someone who is paying attention to their language or who, is doing the best they can. So that's the difference between language and communication. Head over to the discussion boards and journal to continue processing that. And we'll take a stab at dissecting some of this technical information and how it relates to the real world of rules, arbitrariness, and culture. Hooray! Know the difference between language and communication.